On New Year's Eve, a billionaire who thought he owned every room he entered let a trembling waitress pull him into the shadows, never knowing she was saving him from a toast that wasn't meant to celebrate, but to erase him in plain sight. Ethan Hale had come early for quiet, a private breath before the cameras found him, and the year turned over like a polished coin. Sofia Alvarez had come early because workers always do, because the night belongs to the guests and the burden belongs to the hands that carry it. She didn't look like a hero, not in that red uniform with gold piping and a name tag most people never read. But when she gripped his wrist, her courage felt heavier than his entire fortune, and it was already changing the shape of his life. The luxury restaurant buzzed with low chatter and clinking glassware, while warm golden lights wrapped everything in a soft, expensive glow that promised comfort without asking questions. Beyond the swinging door, 2026 shimmered in bright bulbs over the dining room like a gentle blessing, and the smell of roasted meat and sweet wine drifted through the corridor as if nothing bad could happen under such pretty light. Ethan believed it would be just another carefully managed evening, the kind where he smiled, donated, and left before the world asked too much of him. He stepped into the back hallway to avoid attention, passing stainless steel counters and stacked plates, feeling oddly anonymous in a place he usually never saw. Then a figure moved fast at his side, and the air shifted with a sudden urgency that didn't belong to celebration. Sofia's eyes were wide, not with the nervousness of someone afraid to be fired, but with the clear, sharp fear of someone who had heard something she could not unhear. She pulled him behind a tall rack of trays, close enough that he caught the faint scent of dish soap on her sleeves and the quick tremble in her breath. "Stay quiet," she whispered, and pressed one finger to her lips, the gesture so small and absolute that it made Ethan freeze like a man hearing his own name spoken in a dark church. Footsteps approached, steady and confident, and the soft crackle of a radio grew louder until it felt like it was inside Ethan's chest. A security guard appeared at the corridor's end, scanning the space with bored authority, and Ethan realized with a sick clarity that he was not being protected from embarrassment. He was being hidden from something deliberate. What Sofia did next wasn't about money, and it wasn't about politics, and it certainly wasn't about impressing a man whose face had been printed on magazine covers. It was about dignity, the kind that makes a person refuse to watch harm unfold just because it would be easier to look away. Ethan had spent his life believing danger came with noise, lawsuits, headlines, rivals who announced themselves with sharp smiles and expensive threats. But Sofia's bravery was quiet, and the danger she feared was quieter still, disguised behind linen tablecloths and rehearsed laughter. In that narrow corridor, with warm celebration on one side and cold steel on the other, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, the helplessness of not knowing who to trust. The guard paused, his gaze sliding over the trays and the closed doors, and Sofia didn't move, not even when Ethan's pulse thudded so hard he was sure it would give them away. For a breathless moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its own breath with them, the distant music and cheers muffled, as if the building itself had turned its head. Then the guard shifted, muttered something into his radio, and walked on, leaving only the fading rhythm of his steps and the thin edge of relief that felt almost painful. Ethan exhaled, and in the silence that followed, he finally noticed Sofia's name tag. Sofia, like a truth he should have learned long before tonight. And somewhere beyond the glowing 2026, the celebration kept sparkling, unaware that the first minute of the new year might already be arranged as a trap. Ethan stayed pressed behind the tray rack, feeling the ridiculous closeness of metal and heat, as if the whole world had narrowed into a corridor no wider than a mistake. Sofia's fingers remained locked around his wrist, not possessive, but anchoring, like she was keeping him from drifting back into something dangerous and bright. He could hear the guards' boots fading, the rubber soles whispering against the floor, and yet his body refused to unclench. In the dining room beyond, laughter rose and fell in waves, and the sound of it made his stomach twist because it proved how easily fear could hide inside celebration. When Sofia finally lowered her hand from her lips, the silence between them felt like a question neither of them knew how to ask. Up close, she didn't look dramatic or theatrical. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes of people who work while others watch the clock. Her red uniform was spotless, but her knuckles were slightly raw, and Ethan noticed a faint line on her wrist that didn't match the softness of the room's music. He wanted to speak in the voice he used in board meetings, firm, controlled, certain, but the hallway stole that voice from him and replaced it with a whisper he didn't recognize. "What is this?" he breathed, and even that sounded too loud. Sofia stared past him for a beat, listening for footsteps that might return, and then she met his gaze with a steadiness that didn't match her shaking hands. "Not here," she murmured, and the way she said it made him feel like a man being instructed in his own house. They edged away from the trays, moving as if the air itself could betray them, and Ethan caught sight of his reflection in a steel panel. His suit, his expensive watch, his face tightened into something almost unfamiliar. The image looked absurd in this working corridor, like wealth wearing the wrong costume, and for the first time in years, he felt exposed without anyone even looking at him. Sofia led him farther down, passing stacked plates and shelves of folded linens, and the building's design became obvious in a way it never had before. The wealthy flowed one direction, the workers another, and the two streams were meant to never touch. Somewhere behind a closed door, someone laughed too loudly, and Ethan flinched at the sound, wondering how many dangers came wrapped in comfort. He glanced at Sofia's name tag again, as if reading it might make her less of a stranger, and the quiet sting of his own ignorance surprised him. Sofia stopped near a service alcove where the light was dimmer, and she spoke without ornament, as if she couldn't afford the luxury of storytelling. "You were going to be at a private table," she said, her voice tight, "and they were going to bring a bottle, a special bottle." Ethan's mind tried to force the words into a harmless shape, marketing, a sponsor, a showy gesture, but something in her expression refused to be domesticated into normal. "I heard them," she went on, and the phrase carried the weight of someone who had accidentally stepped into a conversation meant for people who believed the staff were furniture. Ethan's instinct was to reach for his phone, to summon his head of security, to solve this like every other problem he'd ever solved. But Sofia's hand rose and hovered near the device without touching it. "If you call the wrong person," she whispered, "you won't get help. You'll give them time." That was when the fear changed shape, settling into Ethan's chest like a cold stone that wouldn't melt under reason. He realized he was used to danger that came with warning signs, angry emails, hostile negotiations, rivals who wanted to be seen. But this was different. Something that moved quietly through trusted channels, dressed in politeness and procedure. Sofia watched him closely, as if she could tell he was searching for a way to return to control, and for a second her eyes softened with something like pity. "I don't know who to trust," Ethan admitted, and the confession tasted bitter because it was the first honest sentence he'd spoken all night. The golden glow from the dining room spilled faintly into the corridor, warm and inviting, and Ethan understood that walking back into it could mean walking into a story written by someone else. And standing there beside Sofia, he felt the terrible, necessary choice forming inside him. Follow her into uncertainty, or step into the glitter and pretend he never heard a thing. Ethan had always believed his life was built from clean choices made in clean rooms, the kind with glass walls and quiet air conditioning. He woke before sunrise, ran until his lungs burned, and signed papers that moved millions with the same hand that held a charity program's ribbon for photographers. People called him disciplined, visionary, self-made, and he let those words sit on his shoulders like a tailored coat. But discipline over the years had also become a way to avoid feeling too much, to keep grief and longing sealed behind appointments. Tonight, standing in a service corridor that smelled of heat and soap, he felt that coat slip, and the man underneath it suddenly seemed less certain. He thought of the dining rooms he'd owned with his presence, the effortless nods from managers, the chairs pulled out before he even reached the table. He remembered the polished smiles of partners who toasted him, praising the good he did, while never asking what it cost him to remain untouchable. Somewhere inside all that praise lived an old loneliness he rarely named, the quiet that followed him home when the city lights faded. He had money for any comfort, yet he'd never learned the simple comfort of being known, of being looked at without calculation. The restaurant's warm glow, just beyond the staff door, suddenly felt like a stage he'd performed on for too long. Sofia's life, Ethan realized, must have been built from different materials entirely. Time measured in hours on her feet, not numbers in an account. In her voice, there was the controlled softness of someone trained to be pleasant, even when afraid, and in her posture there was the quick readiness of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. He noticed how she listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole body, as if danger had taught her to read rooms the way others read menus. There were small signs of sacrifice everywhere, the faint dryness on her hands, the practiced neatness of her uniform, the way she kept her breathing quiet. Ethan sensed she carried responsibilities that didn't show on a name tag, responsibilities that followed her off shifts and into sleepless nights. The building itself seemed designed to keep their worlds apart, with velvet and candlelight on one side and stainless steel and steam on the other. Ethan had always known the back rooms existed, of course, but he'd treated them like a hidden engine, necessary, unseen, and best left unquestioned. Now, walking beside Sofia, he understood that this hidden place was where real endurance lived, where people held up the weight of celebration without ever being invited into it. He felt an uncomfortable recognition. He could describe the wine list from memory, yet he didn't know the names of the people who carried it to him. The imbalance wasn't just economic, it was moral, and it had been growing quietly for years. Sofia stopped near a shelf stacked with folded linens, as if the softness of cloth could somehow soften what she was about to say. Her eyes lifted to his, and her fear sharpened into something steadier, something that looked like a decision already made. "I wasn't trying to listen," she whispered, "but they talked like I wasn't there, like I was part of the wall." She told him about a private table that had been reassigned at the last moment, about a bottle kept out of the normal inventory, about a man in a suit who kept repeating the same instructions as if rehearsing a performance. Then her voice dropped even lower, the words pressing into the air like a secret that could bruise. "They said it would look like celebration," Sofia breathed, "and they said your name like it was the final ingredient." Ethan felt the words "final ingredient" settle inside him like something cold and heavy, the way bad news always did when it arrived without a headline. He wanted to laugh it off, to turn it into a misunderstanding that could be fixed with one phone call and a stern conversation. But Sofia's face didn't have the looseness of someone guessing, and her fear didn't feel like drama. It felt measured, earned, and recent, as if she'd only just found the courage to carry it. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said, and the quiet authority in his voice sounded thinner than he intended. Sofia spoke in fragments at first, because that was how panic remembered things, in sharp pieces rather than neat paragraphs. "A private table near the center of the room," she said, "close enough to be seen, far enough to be protected by the noise. A bottle brought out separately, not from the normal bar, presented like a gift meant to make the guests smile and the cameras lean in. A little signal between staff, something as small as a nod, so the timing would land right before midnight, when everyone's attention turned sentimental. Ethan pictured it with sudden clarity. His glass raised, the room applauding, and a moment later the story already being told for him. The thought wasn't just frightening, it was insulting, as if someone believed his life could be ended like a performance cue. His instinct snapped toward control, toward his phone, toward the team of people whose job was to keep danger at a distance. Yet Sofia stepped closer, lowering her voice even more, like she was afraid the walls had ears. "If you call anyone who answers to the manager tonight," she warned, "they'll know you're awake." Ethan stared at her, startled by the simplicity of what she meant. Power wasn't only money or muscle, it was access to security schedules, to staff assignments, to the story that would be printed afterward. He had always assumed his wealth brought safety, but now he saw how wealth also attracted people who learned to hide their intentions behind professionalism. In that corridor, he understood something he'd refused to learn in boardrooms. The most dangerous traps are built by people who smile while they build them. They moved again, careful and quiet, and as they passed a doorway, Ethan caught sight of the dining room, gold light, white linen, and the glowing 2026 hanging like a blessing above it all. A manager drifted between tables with effortless charm, the kind that made guests feel important and staff feel small. Ethan recognized the style immediately. Warmth on the surface, pressure underneath, a hand that guided without appearing to push. He watched the manager pause beside a waiter, whisper something, and the waiter's posture changed, tightened, obedient, before he hurried away. Sofia's jaw clenched, and Ethan saw anger flicker under her fear, like a match kept dry for the right moment. "What did you do after you heard it?" Ethan asked, and Sofia hesitated, as if admitting it would cost her something. She told him she tried to confirm it without being obvious, that she'd followed the bottle's path like someone tracing a leak in a pipe. She'd seen it stored separately, handled carefully, and treated with a strange respect that didn't match a simple celebratory gift. She'd also heard one more thing, a name spoken softly with certainty, like the person behind it didn't need to be introduced. Ethan waited for her to say it, feeling his own pulse return, steady but hard, and when she finally leaned in, her words struck him as sharply as a slap. "It's not an outsider," she whispered, "and I think you've trusted them before." Ethan wanted to pin Sofia's warning to a name, because names made threats manageable, and manageable things could be solved. He scanned his memory the way he scanned spreadsheets, searching for the familiar smile that could hide a knife, for the colleague who had lingered too long near his glass at past events. But Sofia's words weren't an accusation yet. They were a flare shot into a dark sky, and the light it gave him was unsettling rather than useful. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to listen the way she listened, carefully, for what people did not say. "Show me," he murmured, and Sofia nodded as if she'd been waiting for him to stop trying to command the situation and start trying to understand it. They drifted back toward the edge of the dining room, not into the spotlight, but close enough to observe the flow of staff and the choreography of service. Ethan noticed something he'd never noticed before, the way certain employees were positioned like pieces on a board, the way certain trays appeared at certain times, the way the manager's gaze kept returning to the center of the room as if checking the alignment of a plan. Sofia pretended to straighten napkins near a side station, her movements smooth and practiced, and she pointed with the smallest tilt of her chin. A server passed carrying a bottle wrapped in velvet, held a little higher than necessary, as if it were a trophy meant to be seen. Ethan's throat tightened because he felt the intention behind it. This wasn't hospitality, it was theater. He stepped toward a host stand, as if he belonged there because he did, and asked a casual question about seating for later. The host's smile came instantly, polished and bright. but the answer was too quick, too perfectly shaped. Ethan asked about the bottle, calling it a sponsor gift, testing whether the truth would wobble, and the host's eyes flickered, just a flicker, before returning to their rehearsed warmth. "A special moment for a special guest," the host said, and the phrase sounded like something memorized rather than felt. Ethan felt a small sting of humiliation, not because someone might be plotting against him, but because the room he thought he controlled was now controlling what he was allowed to know. In the glow of the chandeliers, deception looked just like good service. Sofia guided him back into the service corridor before his presence could draw attention, and as they moved, a man in a suit brushed past them with a clipboard tucked to his chest. His tone was low but sharp as he corrected a young busser for walking too slowly, and the busser apologized 3 times before hurrying away. Sofia kept her face neutral, the way employees were trained to, but Ethan saw her shoulders stiffen as if she'd been struck. When the suited man turned, his hand caught Sofia's wrist. Not hard enough to leave an obvious mark, but hard enough to communicate ownership, and he hissed a quick instruction about staying on schedule. The contact lasted only a second, yet it left a bruise of meaning in the air. Ethan felt his stomach drop, because the power in that grip was casual, practiced, and certain. After the man disappeared, Sofia flexed her fingers as if trying to shake off the feeling, and she lifted her sleeve just enough for Ethan to see a faint discoloration, where fingers had pressed too often. It wasn't a dramatic injury, nothing that would make a scene, which was exactly what made it worse. It was the kind of harm that survived because it was easy to deny. Ethan's chest tightened with shame, because he suddenly understood how many moments like that could happen under the roof of luxury without ever reaching the people who paid for the illusion. "I can protect you," he said reflexively, offering the only language he'd ever used to solve problems. Sofia looked at him, and the sadness in her expression felt older than her years. "Protection isn't a promise," she whispered. "It's a choice that costs." And in the distance, the music swelled again as the countdown inched closer, and Ethan sensed that whatever he did next would leave a mark, either on his reputation or on his conscience. Ethan's first impulse was to walk straight into the dining room, take the velvet-wrapped bottle in his own hand, and force the truth into the light with the kind of public authority he'd used to end arguments and close deals. He could already imagine the faces turning, the hush spreading, and his own voice cutting cleanly through the music like a gavel. Pride in his world often passed for courage, and he'd spent years believing that being bold was the same as being right. But Sofia didn't flinch at his status the way others did. She flinched at his noise, as if sound itself could summon danger. "Not like that," she breathed, and her words weren't timid, they were urgent, the kind of urgency that comes from knowing how easily powerful people rewrite what happened. She led him deeper into the back passages, where the walls were plain and the air was warmer, thick with the working heartbeat of the building. Here, the restaurant revealed its true design, a beautiful facade for the guests, and a maze for the labor that made the beauty possible. Ethan passed carts stacked with clean glasses and trays covered with domes, and he realized how carefully the invisible world was managed, how many doors existed solely to keep wealth from seeing effort. The deeper they went, the more his anger turned from simple fear into something sharper, an awareness that someone had weaponized this hidden system against him. Sofia pointed out a narrow doorway and a corner where a security camera blinked, and Ethan noticed the angle of it, how it watched the staff corridor like an eye trained to catch the wrong kind of movement. They paused behind a shelf of folded tablecloths while another staff member hurried past, whispering "excuse me" like a prayer, and Sofia murmured what she'd pieced together. Whoever planned this hadn't just planned an act. They'd planned the story afterward, deciding what witnesses would see and what they would never notice. The bottle would appear as generosity, the toast as goodwill, and whatever happened next would be explained as tragedy, accident, or perhaps even a consequence of Ethan's own recklessness. Ethan felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the cruelty of that elegance. Harm dressed as celebration, intention disguised as tradition. He'd always respected competence, but this was competence without conscience, and it made his skin crawl. Sofia watched him, reading the storm in his face, and quietly named the danger he hadn't wanted to admit. "They're counting on you being you," she said, and the sentence landed like a weight on his shoulders. Ethan's habits were predictable to people who studied him. He arrived early when he could, avoided crowds when he was tired, accepted ceremonial gestures without questioning them because he believed he'd earned a peaceful evening. He thought about the way he'd smiled through 1,000 toasts, letting others shape moments around him while he focused on the next deal, the next headline, the next obligation. Tonight, someone had turned that predictability into a trap. And the worst part was that it was his own pride, his confidence in being untouchable, that made the trap possible. Outside, the music shifted into something brighter, a song designed to lift glasses and hearts at the same time, and Ethan felt the pull of the dining room like gravity. He could return to the glow, sit at his table, and pretend he was still the man who controlled outcomes, letting the night carry him forward like every other night had. Or he could let Sofia guide him through these narrow corridors, trusting a woman the world would overlook, admitting that humility might be the only shield strong enough to keep him alive. He looked at her red uniform, at the small, steady set of her mouth, and he realized she wasn't asking him to be brave the way he liked. Loudly, publicly, with applause waiting at the end. She was asking him to be brave in the quiet, where no one would clap, and the only reward would be doing the right thing. And as the countdown crept closer, Ethan understood with a bitter clarity that the most dangerous moment would come disguised as comfort, right when he thought he was safe. Sofia guided Ethan toward a small manager's office tucked behind the service area, the kind of room guests never knew existed, where schedules, keys, and quiet power lived. The hallway narrowed, and the air changed. Less steam, more stale carpet, as if the building itself grew secretive the closer they got to control. Ethan kept his shoulders square, trying to wear confidence like armor, but every step sounded louder than it should have, and every shadow felt capable of holding someone. Sofia moved with a cautious certainty, counting corners and listening for footsteps the way someone listens for thunder before the rain hits. When she pushed the office door open, she did it slowly, as if expecting the room to bite. Inside, the light was dim, and the furniture was too neat, arranged like a place where truth could be filed away. A desk sat beneath a framed photo of the dining room in its perfect state, candles, smiles, and clean lines, like a reminder of the illusion they were supposed to protect. Ethan reached for the phone on the desk first, old habit guiding him. Landlines felt safer, more official, less likely to be intercepted by chance. He lifted the receiver and waited for the dial tone, but the silence that met him was dead and absolute, like the building had been unplugged from the world. He tried again, pressing the hook, listening harder, as if willpower could summon sound. Sofia's face tightened as she stepped closer and whispered, "They cut it." Ethan's own phone buzzed, and for a split second relief flooded him, until he saw the screen struggle, signal bars collapsing to nothing. Then a message appeared anyway, arriving like a needle through fabric, clean and deliberate. He opened it, and his breath caught, because it was a photo of him entering the staff corridor earlier, his figure framed in the harsh kitchen light, caught at an angle that made him look sneaky, guilty, like a man doing something he shouldn't. The image wasn't accidental, it was composed, a piece of evidence built before the crime it was meant to explain. Ethan felt his stomach drop as the second layer of the trap revealed itself. It wasn't enough to remove him. They intended to control the story afterward, to make him look like the author of his own downfall. In that instant, he understood what real power looked like when it had no morals left. It didn't just harm you, it wrote history over your body. Sofia crossed the room and checked the office window blinds, peering out through a thin crack, and Ethan watched her hands tremble as she held herself steady. The sounds outside shifted, quieter laughter, a distant pop of champagne, and underneath it all, the purposeful rhythm of boots in the corridor. Ethan's mind raced through names, alliances, old grudges, contracts he'd signed, and hands he'd shaken, trying to find the moment he'd opened the door to this. He wanted to roar, to burst out and demand answers, to force the trap to reveal its builder, but Sofia's expression warned him that pride would be the quickest way to die. She turned toward him and shook her head, as if reading his thoughts before he could speak them. "They want you to panic," she whispered. "That's how they finish it." Then the office door handle moved. It wasn't a sudden yank, it was a slow turn, patient and confident, as if whoever stood outside knew exactly what was inside and had all the time in the world. Ethan's blood ran cold, and for a heartbeat his body refused to move, caught between disbelief and survival. Sofia stepped in front of him without thinking, her red uniform a bright, fragile barrier against whatever waited on the other side. The latch clicked once, soft as a whisper, and Sofia leaned closer to Ethan's ear, her voice breaking and steady at the same time. "They think you're already guilty," she breathed, and as the door began to open, Ethan realized he had just lost the one thing he'd always relied on: control. Ethan and Sofia slipped out of the office the instant the door cracked, not by force, but by timing. Sofia tugging him through a side gap behind a filing cabinet that opened into a narrow storage passage meant for boxes and forgotten supplies. The man who entered the office didn't see them. He stepped in with the calm certainty of someone who believed the room would contain only fear and surrender. Ethan heard the soft scrape of shoes on carpet, the rustle of paper, and a low voice into a radio, and it felt unreal that his life had become something hunted in back hallways. They moved deeper into the building's hidden veins until the sounds of celebration dulled into a distant pulse, like a heart beating for a world that didn't know he might vanish before midnight. When they finally stopped inside a cramped storage room, Ethan's lungs burned, as if he'd run miles, and yet the worst part was how silent his panic sounded in his own head. The room smelled of cardboard and bleach, and a single bulb flickered overhead, casting their shadows in nervous, uneven shapes. Ethan leaned a hand against the wall, trying to steady himself, and felt the absurdity of it all, his empire, his influence, his carefully built image, reduced to a man pressed against paint and dust. Sofia stood with her back to the door, listening, her shoulders lifted, as if she could physically hold the danger back. In the thin gap under the door, light slid across the floor whenever someone passed outside, and each sweep of brightness made Ethan's stomach tighten. He realized he'd always thought fear belonged to other people, the people without attorneys, without security teams, without options. Now fear belonged to him too, and it didn't care what his net worth was. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, because speaking would make the situation real in a way breathing had not. Then Sofia's voice came, small but steady, as if she'd been carrying it like a stone and could no longer bear the weight. "I almost didn't say anything," she admitted. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the softness in the confession, and saw that beneath her courage there was exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting battles no one applauds. "You could have walked away," he said, and he meant it in more than one way. Walk away from him, from this job, from the risk. Sofia swallowed. and her eyes shone with the painful honesty of someone who'd learned that silence can keep you employed, but not always keep you whole. "Silence is how I survive," she whispered, but tonight it felt like it would make me part of it. Ethan's chest tightened with something he didn't want to name, because naming it would mean admitting how often he'd chosen comfort over conscience. He thought of all the times he'd stepped past an uncomfortable scene and told himself it wasn't his place, that someone else would handle it, that the system worked. He thought of the word policy, how easily it could become a shield for cruelty, how often it protected the powerful and punished the vulnerable. The muffled cheers from the dining room swelled again, and he pictured people raising glasses, laughing, believing in fresh starts, while, a few walls away, a plan moved quietly toward an ending. Ethan suddenly wondered how many endings had been quietly arranged in his world without him noticing, simply because he hadn't been the target. The thought made his throat burn with shame. Sofia kept watch, but her gaze softened as she studied him, as if she was seeing the human behind the headlines for the first time. Ethan met her eyes and felt something crack open inside him. Not weakness, but awareness, sharp and uncomfortable. "If this is happening," he said, voice low, "it means someone close to me wants it." Sofia didn't answer right away. Her silence was not fear now, but caution, like she knew the truth could be heavier than the danger. Outside the storage room, footsteps passed again, slower this time, lingering as if searching, and the bulb overhead flickered hard enough to make the shadows jump. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second and realized he was no longer asking only how to survive. He was asking what kind of man he would be if he did. And in that cramped room, with the countdown inching forward in a world of glitter and music, he felt the terrifying possibility that this night wasn't just a threat. It was a test. Sofia broke the silence first, not with a speech, but with a memory that sounded like a rope thrown into dark water. "There's an old maintenance route," she said, eyes fixed on the door as if she could see through it. "And there's someone here who still believes the truth matters." Ethan wanted to ask how she could be sure, but he heard the steadiness returning to her voice, the way fear sometimes sharpens into purpose when there's no other choice. She cracked the storage room door just enough to listen, then slipped out with Ethan close behind, moving in the narrow space between stacked supplies and humming machines. The restaurant's back corridors seemed to breathe around them, hot air from the kitchen mixing with colder drafts from service exits, and Ethan felt like he was walking through a hidden city built beneath the one guests applauded. They reached a dish pit area where the noise of running water covered their whispers, and Sofia signaled an older man in a soaked apron, his posture bent from years, his hands strong and steady as he stacked plates with quiet rhythm. He looked up and didn't startle, as if nothing in the building surprised him anymore, and when Sofia spoke his name, his eyes softened with the familiar warmth of someone who had watched her grow tired and still keep going. Ethan recognized that kind of relationship instantly, not friendship born from leisure, but loyalty forged by shared labor and small mercies. The older man listened without interrupting, his gaze occasionally sliding toward the hall, not fearful, just careful. When Sofia finished, he nodded once, slow and certain, as if confirming something he'd suspected all night. "They're moving things, like they don't want a mistake," he murmured, and his voice carried a quiet authority that didn't need a title. He told them about unusual orders, about a schedule that had been rewritten twice, about signatures that carried weight without matching the usual chain of command. Ethan tried to offer money, an automatic reflex, a way to turn urgency into transaction, but the older man's eyes hardened with disappointment rather than greed. "Keep it," he said simply. "If you get out of this, use your power the right way. Don't come back to these halls and pretend you never saw them." The sentence landed deep in Ethan's chest. because it was the first time tonight someone had spoken to him without fear or flattery, only expectation. The older man led them to a bulletin board half hidden behind a swinging door, where paper schedules clung under magnets like fragile maps of the night. Sofia scanned the sheet with quick focus, tracing names, times, and stations, and Ethan watched her mind work, sharp, practiced, unwilling to surrender. She found the note about the special presentation, written in tidy script, and her finger hovered over the timing, just minutes before midnight, when the room would be loud enough to swallow confusion and bright enough to blind witnesses. Ethan felt his pulse steady into something harder than panic, because now they weren't guessing. They were reading the blueprint. Sofia looked up at him, and for the first time her fear wasn't the loudest thing in her expression. It was determination. But as Ethan stared at that schedule, another truth rose quietly beside the first. Knowing when didn't mean knowing who. The plan depended on a final signal, a last nod or whispered word that would set the moment in motion, and that signal could come from anyone with the right access. Sofia folded the paper carefully, like it was both evidence and prayer, and slipped it into her apron, as if protecting it with her own body. Ethan glanced toward the dining room entrance, where gold lights spilled like temptation, and he realized the countdown was no longer just time. It was a narrowing path. They had a map, they had a moment, and they had the fragile courage of a small group standing against a machine. And somewhere in the glow of 2026, the person who would give the final signal was already smiling. Ethan followed Sofia through a narrow passage that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and hot bread, and with every step he felt the restaurant's two worlds pressing closer together, like the building itself was trying to squeeze them back into their assigned places. The schedule sheet in Sofia's apron seemed to weigh on him more than any contract he'd ever signed, because it wasn't paper. It was a countdown. Somewhere beyond the swinging doors, guests were already leaning into the warmth of the night, believing that a new year could be bought with music and champagne. Ethan's mind kept replaying what the older dishwasher had said, not as a warning, but as a demand. Use your power the right way. He realized survival would mean more than staying alive. It would mean refusing to let Sofia become the price of his escape. They reached a point where the service corridor opened near a side entrance to the dining room, and Ethan dared to steal another look at the celebration. The golden 2026 lights hung above the crowd like a promise, yet now they seemed to flicker in his mind like an alarm, bright enough to distract and steady enough to hypnotize. He watched the manager glide between tables with perfect timing, appearing exactly where attention needed guiding, speaking softly to staff and laughing just loudly enough for guests to feel reassured. Then Ethan saw it. So small most people would miss it. A clear earpiece tucked behind the manager's hairline, catching the chandelier's glow. Sofia noticed it too, her breath tightening, and Ethan felt the last pieces click into place. This wasn't chaos. It was coordination in real time. In Ethan's world, the most dangerous person was rarely the one who shouted. It was the one who made everyone else move without raising their own voice. He remembered past dinners, past fundraisers, past perfect events where nothing ever went wrong. And he understood now how much of that perfection had been engineered by people who knew how to control narratives. Whoever was behind tonight's plan wasn't just betting on a poisoned moment. They were betting on the audience's willingness to accept an easy story. Ethan imagined headlines forming like storm clouds: a tragic accident, an unfortunate incident, a billionaire undone by indulgence or arrogance, and a hard-working waitress blamed for a mistake she never made. The cruelty of it tightened his throat, because it wasn't simply about ending him. It was about keeping the system clean afterward. Sofia whispered that she could slip away, disappear into the back, avoid being seen near him when the moment arrived. Ethan surprised himself by shaking his head, not because he wanted her close, but because he finally understood what protection meant in her language. "If they plan to use you as the story," he murmured, "then we rewrite the story first." He thought of one person outside the restaurant who still answered only to him, someone he'd kept at a distance out of habit, like trust was a resource best rationed. He didn't call yet, not from here, not where cameras and listening devices might catch him, but the plan formed in his mind with steady edges. The truth would need witnesses who weren't chosen by the manager, and it would need timing sharp enough to cut through the champagne haze. Ethan's heart steadied into a strange calm, the kind that comes when fear turns into decision, and he looked at Sofia with a seriousness that didn't ask for her courage. It honored it. "We don't run from the toast," he said quietly. "We let them bring it, and we make sure the right eyes are watching when they do." Sofia's face tightened with dread at the thought of stepping into the trap, yet beneath it Ethan saw something else, relief that he wasn't going to abandon her to save himself. The music swelled again, and the room's laughter rose like a tide, and the glowing 2026 seemed to hover over them like a countdown that could not be paused. Then Ethan turned toward the warm light of the dining room, ready to walk back into the celebration as if nothing had changed, knowing the most dangerous part was still ahead, because now he would be smiling on purpose. Ethan returned to the dining room with a calm that felt borrowed, as if he were wearing someone else's skin for protection. He moved through the glow of candles and crystal, like a man who belonged there, which he did. Yet now every smile around him looked like a mask with its own private purpose. Sofia stayed a few steps away, merging back into her role, her posture composed in that practiced way that kept her safe most nights. The schedule sheet pressed against her apron like a secret heartbeat, and Ethan could see the effort it took for her hands not to shake as she lifted trays and nodded politely at guests who never met her eyes. To the room, she was just another waitress. To Ethan, she had become the line between truth and a lie that could ruin them both. They drifted toward a side station where servers checked orders, and Sofia leaned in, as if adjusting place settings, listening with the kind of attention people mistake for obedience. Two staff members spoke quietly about the special moment, and one of them repeated a phrase that made Sofia's face tighten. "If anything goes wrong, it's on the red uniform girl." The words were tossed out like routine, like contingency planning, and that casualness made Ethan's chest burn. He had expected the trap to be aimed at him. He had not expected the plan to include a second victim chosen for how easy she would be to blame. Sofia's eyes met his for half a second, and in that glance Ethan saw a flicker of old hurt that didn't start tonight. She pulled him back toward the service edge under the pretense of needing his approval for something, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like it had been scraped thin by fear. "They're not just trying to hurt you," she whispered. "They're trying to make me the mistake." Ethan felt his stomach turn, not only at the cruelty, but at how perfectly the story would work. A powerful man gone, a powerless woman sacrificed, and the restaurant promising full cooperation while quietly protecting whoever held the real strings. He suddenly remembered how often he'd read headlines like that and moved on, believing the official statement because it was easier than imagining the machinery behind it. Now he could feel that machinery turning, smooth and merciless, and he realized how many people had been fed into it before. Sofia hesitated, then admitted something that startled him more than the plan itself. "I recognized you," she said softly, and the confession didn't sound like starstruck familiarity, but like a memory she wished she didn't have to carry. Ethan searched her face, trying to place her in the glossy spaces of his life, until she gave him the detail that cut straight through his defenses. "At a hospital fundraiser," she murmured. "My mum needed help. We were turned away because of policy. They said the event wasn't for cases like ours." Ethan's throat tightened as he remembered that night. Not her face, but the atmosphere. Champagne, polite speeches, the comfort of doing good in a room built for people who never had to beg. He hadn't made the decision, he told himself, but the truth was worse. He'd never asked who the decisions hurt. The revelation didn't paint Sofia as resentful. It painted her as someone who had learned how to survive disappointment without becoming cruel. And it painted Ethan as someone who had benefited from systems he'd never bothered to look at closely. "I'm not doing this because I hate you," she whispered, as if she could hear the thought forming in his silence. "I'm doing it because I can't watch another powerful person disappear and another worker get blamed for it." Ethan's anger rose, but it wasn't the clean anger of a rival. It was the sick anger of realizing how much harm could hide inside normal. His eyes swept the room and landed on the manager again, still smiling, still guiding, still too calm for a night that should be simple. And then Ethan saw what made his blood run colder than fear. The manager wasn't acting alone. A figure near the bar leaned in just slightly, watching Ethan with a familiarity that felt personal, not professional, like someone checking a clock they owned. Ethan didn't need the person's name yet to understand the shape of the truth. This wasn't random, and it wasn't only about money. Someone stood to gain from Ethan being removed tonight, and someone had chosen Sofia as the perfect scapegoat because she was easy to dismiss. Ethan felt the room's warmth turn suffocating as the countdown neared, and he realized the mastermind was close enough to see him smile, close enough to enjoy it, while the final signal waited, just seconds away from being given. Ethan stepped farther into the dining room's glow as if he were simply returning to his seat, and the room welcomed him with the kind of effortless warmth money can buy. Smiles turned toward him in practiced admiration, glasses lifted in small, early toasts, and someone called his name like it was part of the decor. He answered with a calm nod, letting the familiar rhythm carry him, because that was the only way to stay invisible in plain sight. Sofia moved along the perimeter like she belonged there too, balancing a tray with steady hands, her face composed in the careful neutrality that kept her safe, except Ethan could see the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes tracked the manager's movements. The 2026 lights hovered above them, bright and innocent, while the air beneath them felt sharpened by intention. The manager approached at the perfect moment, gliding through the crowd as if guided by music only he could hear, and Ethan recognized the discipline in that timing. In his hands was the velvet-wrapped bottle, carried a little higher than necessary, displayed like a crown meant for a king who didn't know his throne was wired to collapse. "Mr. Hale," the manager said, voice smooth as warm wine, "we wanted to honor you tonight." His smile widened, and it could have passed for kindness if Ethan hadn't seen what that smile did to staff, how it tightened shoulders and erased personalities into obedience. Ethan took a slow breath, feeling the room's attention begin to shift toward them, not fully yet, but leaning, curious, ready to applaud anything that looked like generosity. Under the table edge, Sofia's fingers curled around the folded schedule sheet in her apron, as if she were holding onto a lifeline. Ethan played his part, because tonight's survival required performance, and he lifted his eyes to the manager with a friendly calm that felt almost poisonous. "That's very thoughtful," he said, letting the words land gently. Then he added, soft as a compliment, "You've always been good at timing, haven't you?" The manager's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. The way a person reacts when they realize the other side is not as sleepy as planned. Ethan leaned in just a fraction, as if sharing a private appreciation, and said the manager's name with quiet precision, then mentioned a detail that wasn't supposed to be visible, something from the rewritten schedule, something only someone involved would recognize. For half a second, the manager's expression flickered, a crack in porcelain, and Ethan saw the truth behind the charm: calculation without mercy. Then the mask slid back into place, and the manager laughed lightly, as if Ethan had made a harmless joke. Around them guests smiled, pleased by the show, unaware of the sharp edge beneath it, and Ethan realized how hard it was to make people notice danger when they were committed to comfort. He could feel the room's hunger for a story that felt good, billionaire honored, year turning, everyone clapping, and he understood the trap depended on that hunger. Sofia approached with another tray, as if she were simply doing her job, but Ethan caught her eyes, and in them he saw a message stronger than fear. "Don't let them write this on me." The manager began to unwrap the bottle with deliberate care, drawing out the moment like a conductor building toward a crescendo, and Ethan felt the countdown tightening, each second slipping away into music and laughter. He knew his countermove had to land at the exact instant the plan exposed itself, otherwise it would be swallowed by celebration. The manager tilted the bottle slightly, showing the label to the nearest guests, inviting their attention like a magician flashing his hands before the trick. Ethan smiled wider because he needed the room to keep believing, and in that false ease he searched the crowd again for the familiar watcher near the bar. The figure's gaze remained fixed, patient, almost satisfied, as if enjoying the neatness of what was about to happen, and Ethan's stomach tightened with the realization that the mastermind wanted a perfect ending, clean, public, undeniable. Sofia's tray hovered near Ethan's table now, her movements controlled to the point of stillness, as if she knew the next breath might decide everything. The bottle was almost free of velvet, the room's attention almost fully turned, and Ethan felt himself balanced on a razor's edge, where one wrong word could make Sofia the sacrifice they'd planned. And as the manager lifted the corkscrew, Ethan understood that the confrontation wasn't just between him and the man holding the bottle, it was between truth and the story people wanted to believe. Ethan kept smiling as the manager worked the corkscrew into the bottle, the room leaning closer the way people do when they believe they're about to witness something generous. He lifted his glass, not to drink, but to buy a few seconds, letting the chandeliers catch the rim so it looked like compliance. Sofia stood just behind his chair, poised as if she were only waiting for a cue to serve, yet her eyes never left the manager's hands. Ethan's heartbeat didn't race anymore. It counted steady and exact, matching the invisible clock he'd drawn in his mind. In that calm, he made the smallest movement under the table, one silent signal to the only person he still trusted outside these walls. At first, nothing changed, and the manager's confidence seemed to grow, fed by the room's easy applause and the thick comfort of tradition. Then the side entrance opened with an unfamiliar firmness. Not the swinging ease of staff, but the unmistakable presence of people who weren't there to please. Two officers stepped in with purpose, followed by a plainclothes investigator and a supervisor from the building's security team, who looked bewildered to be led instead of leading. The manager's smile held for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, then tightened at the corners, like thread pulled too far. A hush spread across the nearest tables, creeping outward as guests sensed the story changing shape. Above them, 2026 still glowed, but now it looked less like a promise and more like a spotlight. The manager tried to regain control the way polished people always do, by speaking quickly, warmly, as if the very tone of his voice could turn suspicion into misunderstanding. His eyes slid toward Sofia, and Ethan saw the pivot coming before the words did, the practiced ease of blaming the person who couldn't afford to fight back. "There must be confusion with staff," the manager began, gesturing lightly towards Sofia as if she were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise perfect night. Sofia's face went pale, not with guilt, but with the familiar dread of being chosen as the explanation. That was the moment Ethan stood, not dramatically, but clearly, placing his glass down as if setting a boundary the room could finally see. "No," he said, voice calm and firm. "She's the reason we're all still standing here with nothing to regret." Ethan spoke in plain sentences, refusing the comfort of vague statements, and the room, trained to listen to him, finally listened without distraction. He named what happened without exaggeration: the hidden corridor, the cut landline, the staged photo, the rewritten schedule, the velvet bottle handled outside normal protocol. Sofia stepped forward and produced the folded schedule sheet like evidence she'd carried against her heart, and the older dishwasher arrived at the edge of the dining room, pointing to the altered signatures with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched too much injustice survive on technicalities. The investigator asked short, sharp questions, and the manager's polished answers began to stumble, caught between charm and facts that wouldn't bend. As phones rose around the room, guests suddenly eager to record what they'd nearly applauded, Ethan realized how quickly attention could become accountability when directed the right way. Sofia's hands trembled, but her posture stayed upright, as if she were finally allowing herself to be seen. When the manager tried one last time to laugh it off, Ethan looked him in the eye with a steadiness that didn't seek revenge, only truth, and said, "If you needed a scapegoat, you picked the wrong woman." The investigator nodded toward the manager, and the calm authority of procedure replaced the false authority of hospitality, shifting the power in the room with a single gesture. Sofia exhaled like someone who'd been holding her breath for years, and Ethan felt something loosen inside him too, not relief alone, but the sharp awareness that survival had cost them both something. The guests murmured, not celebrating now, but reconsidering, and the 2026 lights flickered once, as if the building itself had been startled awake. Ethan turned slightly toward Sofia, ready to speak her name out loud in front of everyone, when his phone buzzed again with a new message, one that made his stomach drop for an entirely different reason. The message on Ethan's phone was short enough to be mistaken for spam, yet it struck with the clean brutality of truth. Sofia Alvarez is implicated. Detain if necessary. For a moment, he couldn't hear the room anymore. Couldn't hear the investigator speaking or the soft panic traveling through the guests like wind through dry leaves. He looked up and saw how quickly people's eyes shifted, how easily admiration became suspicion when the story offered them someone simpler to blame. Sofia read something in his face and stiffened, her chin lifting as if she'd already practiced the posture of being accused. It wasn't pride. It was survival, the quiet posture of someone who's been cornered before and learned that collapsing only makes people step harder. Ethan moved before his fear could negotiate, stepping toward the investigator with his phone held out like a lantern. "That order is part of the setup," he said, steady, forcing the room to witness not just a claim, but a decision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm carried the weight of a man who was done letting comfort choose for him. The older dishwasher came closer too, pointing again at the altered schedule, the chain of custody, the handwriting that didn't match, the timeline that made Sofia's guilt impossible. Someone from security tried to speak, then stopped, as if realizing that tonight the usual hierarchy had flipped. Sofia stayed standing, her hands open at her sides, not pleading, not performing innocence, just refusing to become invisible while others decided her fate. When the investigator asked why Ethan was so certain, Ethan surprised himself by answering with something more honest than strategy. "Because she stopped me," he said, "and because she had every reason to stay quiet and she didn't." And the words didn't erase the tension, but they changed its shape. They made the room feel the difference between accusation and truth. The investigator's gaze moved to Sofia, less like someone scanning a suspect now, and more like someone finally seeing a person. Ethan watched Sofia's shoulders lower by the smallest degree, as if a lifetime of bracing had eased for half a breath. The manager, no longer smiling, stared at the floor with the dull shock of someone whose script had been taken away. After the officers guided the manager aside, the dining room didn't return to celebration. It hovered in an awkward, chastened quiet, as if everyone had been forced to recognize the cost of their glitter. Ethan asked to speak with Sofia privately, and they slipped back into the service corridor where the night had begun, away from chandeliers and whispered gossip. The corridor looked the same. Stainless steel, stacked trays, the faint hum of refrigerators, yet it felt different now, like a place that had witnessed a choice. Ethan faced Sofia and began to thank her, then stopped, realizing gratitude could become another performance if it wasn't followed by action. "I can't fix what you've lived," he said softly, "but I can change what happens after tonight." Sofia's eyes glistened, but she didn't soften into easy forgiveness because her life hadn't been built on easy things. "Don't make me the headline," she said quietly. "Make the back rooms safer. Make the policies human. Make it so the next girl doesn't need to be brave just to survive her shift." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of that request settle into him like a vow, and he knew it would anger people who profited from silence. Then Sofia's phone vibrated in her palm, and the screen lit up with a hospital number, too late at night for good news. The color drained from her face as she answered, and Ethan watched the last of her composure strain against sudden fear, the kind that has nothing to do with plots and everything to do with love. She listened, swallowed hard, and whispered, "I'm coming." And when she lowered the phone, her voice trembled as she said, "It's my mom." Something happened. Ethan didn't hesitate, not because he suddenly became a savior, but because he finally understood what help was supposed to sound like. "How do we do this?" Not, "Let me handle it." He followed Sofia through the back exit and into the cold bite of the night air, where the city's lights glittered like they had no idea what nearly happened inside that restaurant. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks tested the sky early, impatient for midnight, and the sound made Sofia flinch as if celebration had become a language she couldn't trust. Ethan called his driver, and then, with a steadiness that surprised even him, called a medical contact he'd met through charity events and never truly needed until now. Sofia watched him, her fear sharp and raw, and for the first time she didn't look at him like a headline. She looked at him like a person who might actually keep a promise. At the hospital, fluorescent lights replaced chandeliers, and the air smelled of antiseptic and worry, a scent that didn't care if you were rich or exhausted or both. Sofia's mother lay behind a curtain, her breathing uneven, her face drawn in that way that makes time feel cruel and fragile. Sofia rushed to her bedside, taking her hand with the tenderness of someone who has been strong too long and can't afford to be gentle, except in secret. Ethan stayed back at first because he sensed this wasn't his space to dominate. But when a nurse approached with paperwork and quiet urgency, he stepped forward the way Sofia had stepped forward for him. He didn't throw money like a shield. He asked questions, listened, and used his influence to cut through delays that were usually disguised as policy. The nurse's expression softened with reluctant relief, the kind that appears when someone finally uses power to open a door instead of guard it. Hours later, when the doctor explained that Sofia's mother would stabilize but needed follow-up care and time, Sofia's shoulders sagged as if a heavy coat had finally been removed. She sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, tears slipping down without shame, and Ethan understood that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stays. He handed her a cup of water from the vending machine, the cheapest drink he'd bought in years, and it felt more honest than any champagne toast. Sofia took it with trembling hands, and for a moment the two of them listened to the hospital's quiet rhythm, Footsteps, distant intercom calls, the soft beeping of machines that measured life 1 second at a time. Ethan looked at Sofia's face, worn by fear, but lit by love, and felt his own life reframe itself around something he'd ignored for too long. People mattered more than appearances. In the weeks that followed, Ethan did what he promised, not in speeches, but in changes that could be seen and felt. Ele exigiu auditórias, removeu gestores que prosperavam na intimidação, criou proteções reais para os funcionários e fez questão de que política nunca mais fosse uma arma contra quem já carregava o peso do mundo nas costas. Voltou ao restaurante em plena luz do dia, atravessou os corredores dos bastidores de propósito, aprendeu nomes, ouviu histórias, perguntou o que faltava, em vez de supor que já sabia. Sofia permaneceu ali, não porque a vida ficou fácil de repente, mas porque finalmente existia algo que antes faltava: dignidade sem medo. A mãe dela se recuperou aos poucos, e o sorriso de Sofia voltou com firmeza, não como performance, mas como amanhecer depois de uma noite longa. Na virada seguinte, Ethan chegou cedo outra vez, mas desta vez não buscou sombra nem entrada secreta. Entrou de frente, cumprimentando primeiro quem sempre foi invisível. Quando a contagem regressiva se aproximou, ele não pediu garrafa especial nem espetáculo. Pediu água e ergueu o copo simples com uma sinceridade quieta. Aos que escolhem a bondade quando ela custa alguma coisa, ele disse, sem buscar aplauso, apenas dizendo a verdade. Sofia ficou por perto, sem se esconder, sem ser culpada, sem ser apagada, e as luzes quentes do 2026 já não pareciam mentira. E naquele instante, o ano não mudou por causa de fogos ou champanhe, mas porque 2 vidas tinham sido refeitas por um sussurro corajoso num corredor frio. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption. Happy New Year! May your new year be filled with peace, health, and people who treat you with kindness. How are you spending New Year's Eve? Quiet at home, with family, or somewhere special?